You know, when people think of wars, they often imagine battles or armies fighting each other. But the Syrian civil war didn't start that way. It began with people marching on the streets, asking for something simple: freedom and fairness.
That's right. It all started in March 2011. People were tired of the way they were treated by the government. For years, they lived under the rule of President Bashar al-Assad and his father before him. They felt stuck, with no voice to speak out and no hope for change.
The timing was key. Around the same time, protests were happening in other Arab countries, like Tunisia and Egypt. People were rising up against their leaders, and it was called the Arab Spring. Syrians saw this and thought, maybe we can do the same.
But Assad's government wasn't like some of the others. When the protests started, instead of listening, they responded with force. Police and soldiers were sent to stop people, sometimes using weapons. It wasn't just about keeping control, it was about scaring people into staying silent.
And it's important to remember what the protesters wanted. They weren't asking for much at first. They wanted political reforms, better living conditions, and an end to corruption. But when the government reacted so harshly, it made people angrier.
That's when everything began to spiral. What started as peaceful protests turned into something much bigger and more dangerous. Videos of the government's violence spread quickly thanks to mobile phones. The world began to see what was happening, but at the time, nobody could predict just how bad it would get.
So, why were people in Syria so unhappy before 2011? It wasn't just one thing. The problems had been building for years.
Exactly. Let's start with Bashar al-Assad himself. When he became president in 2000, people thought he would bring change. He was young, educated, and talked about modernizing Syria. But those promises didn't last.
Right. Instead of making things better, Assad followed in his father's footsteps. He used strict rules to control the country. People couldn't speak freely, there was heavy surveillance, and anyone who spoke against him could be punished.
And then there were the economic problems. Did you know that between 2006 and 2010, Syria had one of the worst droughts in its history? Farmers couldn't grow crops, and many families lost everything.
Yes, and because of that, a lot of people left their villages and moved to cities. But the cities weren't ready for so many new people. Many ended up living in poor areas, with no proper homes, jobs, or schools.
And don't forget the inequality. While some people close to Assad were getting richer, most Syrians were struggling. The gap between the rich and poor was huge, and it made people feel forgotten by their leaders.
All of this created a lot of anger. Then came the Arab Spring, and it was like a spark that lit the fire. People saw what was happening in other countries and thought, if they can protest, so can we.
The first big protest happened in a city called Daraa. It started when some kids were arrested and tortured for writing anti-government graffiti. Their families and neighbors were furious and demanded justice.
But instead of helping, the government sent in soldiers. They arrested more people and even opened fire on protesters. That only made the protest grow, spreading to other cities.
It's so sad to think that if the government had just listened to its people and made small changes, maybe things wouldn't have gotten so bad. Instead, they chose violence, and that changed everything.
It's hard to believe how quickly things got worse. Those first protests in 2011 started out peaceful, but soon the government's violence made people feel like they had no choice but to fight back.
Yes, and that's when armed groups began to form. At first, it was just local groups protecting their neighborhoods from the government forces. But as time went on, these groups grew and became more organized.
One of the first big groups was the Free Syrian Army. It was made up of soldiers who had left the government's army because they didn't want to fight their own people. They thought they could help lead the fight for freedom.
But it wasn't just about the soldiers. Everyday people were joining too. Many felt that they had nothing left to lose after seeing their homes destroyed or their loved ones killed.
And don't forget the sectarian side of things. Most of the protesters and fighters were Sunni Muslims, but Assad and many of his top officials were from the Alawite minority. That created even more tension between different groups in the country.
That's true, but it's important to note that not all Alawites supported Assad, just like not all Sunnis joined the protests. At first, the fight was more about freedom and fairness than religion.
Unfortunately, as the violence grew, those divisions became deeper. Assad's government started spreading fear, saying that the opposition was full of extremists who wanted to harm minorities. That scared a lot of people.
Meanwhile, the government wasn't just using words. They brought in tanks, helicopters, and heavy weapons to crush entire neighborhoods. Cities like Homs and Aleppo saw some of the worst fighting.
And the world started paying attention. By mid-2011, other countries were taking sides. The US and European countries spoke out against Assad, while Russia and Iran stood by him, sending weapons and money to help him stay in power.
That international support made a huge difference. Without Russia and Iran, Assad might not have lasted as long as he did, but their help also made the war much more complicated.
Yes, because then other countries got involved too. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar started supporting the rebels, hoping to weaken Assad's government. It became more than just a war inside Syria. It became a battle between different powers.
It's heartbreaking to think about how it all started with people asking for change and ended up in such a violent and messy war. So many lives were lost, and it felt like there was no way to stop it.
As the war continued, there were moments when everything changed, like in 2013 when chemical weapons were used. That shocked the whole world.
Yes, I remember. Hundreds of people died in those attacks, and many were children. The rebels blamed Assad's forces, while the government denied it and said the rebels were responsible.
The United Nations sent inspectors to investigate, and countries like the US and France talked about taking military action. But in the end, they made a deal with Assad. He agreed to give up his chemical weapons instead.
But even with that agreement, the war didn't slow down. Another big change came with the rise of ISIL, also known as ISIS. They started as a small group, but quickly took over large parts of Syria and Iraq.
They were brutal. Their fighters not only attacked Assad's forces and the rebels, but also hurt civilians. They became known for things like destroying villages, killing people who didn't agree with them, and even beheading journalists.
And their control of cities like Raqqa made the war even more complicated. Countries like the US started bombing ISIL targets, but they weren't directly helping either the rebels or Assad.
Another turning point was the siege of Aleppo. That city became a symbol of how destructive the war had become. The government, with help from Russia, bombed the rebel-held parts of the city non-stop.
Aleppo was heartbreaking. Hospitals, schools, and homes were destroyed. Even aid workers trying to help were attacked. By the end, the government had taken back the city, but at such a high cost.
Russia's role in all this can't be ignored. When they joined the war in 2015, their airstrikes gave Assad's forces a big advantage. Without Russia, the rebels might have had a chance to push back.
But Russia wasn't the only player. Iran sent fighters, and Hezbollah, a group from Lebanon, also joined the fight on Assad's side. At the same time, countries like Turkey and Saudi Arabia were helping the rebels.
It became a war with so many sides and so many interests. By this point, it wasn't just about Syrians anymore. It was about global politics, power, and control.
And the people caught in the middle, ordinary Syrians, suffered the most. Millions fled their homes trying to escape the violence. It's hard to imagine what they went through.
For years, it seemed like Assad's government was too strong to fall. He had powerful allies like Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. But by 2024, things started to change.
That's right. Russia had its own problems because of the war in Ukraine, and Iran faced new challenges after the Israel-Hamas war. Both countries had less money and fewer resources to support Assad.
And without that help, Assad's forces started losing ground. The rebels, especially groups like HTS, saw an opportunity. They launched a big offensive and began to take back cities.
Aleppo was one of the first cities to fall. It was a big deal because it had been under Assad's control for years. From there, the rebels moved quickly. Within weeks, they had taken over other key places like Homs and Dara.
One of the reasons the rebels were so successful was because Hezbollah pulled out of Syria. They had to focus on defending Lebanon after the fighting there. Without Hezbollah, Assad's forces were much weaker.
And it wasn't just the cities. The rebels cut off important roads and supply lines, making it almost impossible for Assad's troops to get what they needed.
By December 2024, the rebels had surrounded Damascus, the capital. Assad's government was isolated, with no way to get reinforcements. It was only a matter of time.
And then, on December 7th, it happened. The rebels entered Damascus. There wasn't much resistance because most of the government's forces had already given up.
But Assad was gone. He had fled the country before the rebels even arrived. No one knows exactly where he went, but reports say he left to avoid being captured.
The rebels tried to keep things under control. They worked with the prime minister to make sure that government offices and services could still function. They didn't want complete chaos.
It's hard to say what comes next for Syria. The fall of Assad's regime was a big moment, but the country is still facing huge challenges. The damage from the war will take years, maybe decades, to fix.
True, but for many Syrians, it was a moment of hope. After so many years of war and suffering, they finally saw a chance for a new beginning.
When we talk about the Syrian civil war, it's easy to focus on the battles, the leaders, and the politics. But the real story is about the people, millions of Syrians whose lives were completely destroyed.
Yes, the numbers are shocking. More than 500,000 people lost their lives, and millions were forced to leave their homes. Some fled to other countries as refugees, while others became displaced within Syria.
And let's not forget the children. Many grew up knowing nothing but war. Schools were destroyed, and they lost the chance to learn and have a normal childhood. Some even had to work or fight just to survive.
It wasn't just the people who suffered. Cities like Aleppo, Homs, and Raqqa were almost completely destroyed. Historic places, markets, homes, everything was reduced to rubble.
The war also created a refugee crisis. Neighboring countries like Turkey, Lebanon, and Jordan took in millions of Syrians. But even those countries struggled to handle so many people. Life in refugee camps was, and still is, extremely hard.
And yet, the international community didn't do enough to stop the suffering. Some countries helped by giving money or taking in refugees, but they didn't do much to end the war itself.
It's a sad reminder of how divided the world can be. Big powers like the US, Russia, and others seemed more interested in fighting for their own interests than helping the Syrian people.
But there are lessons to learn from this tragedy. One is that ignoring problems doesn't make them go away. The early protests were a warning, but the government and the world didn't listen.
Another lesson is about the dangers of outside interference. When so many countries get involved in a conflict, it often makes things worse instead of better.
That's true. But I think the biggest lesson is about humanity. The war showed us the worst of what people can do, but also the strength of those who survived. Despite everything, Many Syrians are still hopeful for a better future.
And that hope is what matters most. The war might be over for now, but the real work is just beginning, rebuilding lives, communities, and trust. The world owes it to the Syrian people to support them in this new chapter. If there's one thing to take away from this story, it's that every voice matters. Those first protests in 2011 were about wanting to be heard. And even after all these years, that message still stands.
Absolutely. Let's hope the future brings brighter days for Syria and its people. And maybe this story will remind us all to value freedom, fairness, and peace.
Thanks for joining us today. Let us know in the comments whose story you'd like us to talk about next. Don't forget to like this video, share it, and subscribe to our channel for more stories like this one.
See you next time. And remember, history is full of lessons. It's up to us to learn from them.